So this project is to create a new rating system for a game. So I thought I would start out with just a quick trailer for the game involved. All right, so this is actually a very old turn-based strategy game that a few years back has been ported from the old original code base to be playable over the web. Um, it So each player has their own empire, starting out with one planet and one ship and a starbase, and is gradually exploring their world. And building up an empire, working on logistics and diplomacy with other players, and trying basically to conquer most players and take over the galaxy. Let's see. I'll borrow from what was actually on the description here. So there are 11 different races, each with different capabilities, all based on different sci-fi races. The issue that I was trying to address here is that I enjoy playing the game, but I think the game does a very poor job of rating players for skill levels. And so it seems to be very common for players to reach the highest ranks in the game without being among the most skilled players in the game. There's just not enough correlation there. And so that makes it more difficult to find players of similar ability for a game. And even in the case of championship games, where the top-ranked players from each of the different races are brought together in one game, we still sometimes see examples where the players going into those championship games are just not very strong players, and it kind of ruins the idea of a championship. So my intention was to create a new rating system that would do a better job of recognizing the skill of the players involved and their ability to win games. The current rating system is what I would call accumulation based. Every time you play the game, you're going to get some points and your rank tends to go up over time. So even if you never win a game, if you just play lots and lots of games, you will gradually rise up. You can also get points by various ways other than winning, such as just blowing a lot of things up. And what I'm trying to do is to create something that is more focused on keeping track of a player's ability to win games. So do you win, what percentage of your games you're winning, take into account the difficulty of the game. If you were playing against new players and you won, you shouldn't get nearly as much credit for that as if you played against some of the top players in the game. As part of creating a rating system, I need to collect the information that the rating system is based on. So it turns out that the game does have an API that I was able to access, providing various pieces of information about the game. And this is sort of, the drawing here is not based on the API itself, it's based on the way I ended up storing what I found in the API. So an account is one of the people who plays this game. So you sign up at the site, you have an account, you choose a username. People can join in games. So let's say a game has 11 players. I consider the player to just be a slot within that game. So the player exists as soon as the game is created, and then an account will join as that player. So you would have a join event. If you later decided to leave that game, there would be a resign event. If you win the game, it's a win event. And when the game completes, all the people who are still in the game get finish events. So keep track of those. And also keeping track of how well people are doing over the course of the game. So for each turn, we can track how many planets the player has so far, and a military score which represents roughly the value of the military that they built up. It's based on the amount that it would cost them to build the set of ships that they have at the moment. This is represented in Datomic and using the ADI library for Datomic. So I'm now going to put this off to the side a little bit and show the representation of that in the source code. Right. So ADI is a library built on top of Datomic that just gives you a higher level way of working with it. And this is an ADI schema for what I just described. So here's the game, and we can list the attributes associated with it. And game here is pretty simple. There are actually no references to anything else because it's the player that references the game rather than the other way around. So we go on to the next item. We have a reference to the game, and we say a player is required to actually be in a game, and we say which entity type we're referring to. So the rest of this just matches what I just said, and it also allows you to put constraints in. For example, I find that the API often said that a player had an account ID of 0, which was never actually true. That's what the API says when it's not willing to tell you at the moment what the player's account ID is. So I need to make sure that those never get stored into the database. Let's see, I'll show you an example of how we are getting information from the API. So here's a function that fetches the events for a game. Let me move to the right part of our schema. So there are different types of events: the joins, resigns, wins, finishes, and we keep track of what turn it happened on and what day it happened on for a specific player and account. So there is a load events API call. Which is going to list all the events that happen for a particular game, or at least it's supposed to. One of the big challenges in this particular project has just been the quirkiness and unreliability of the API associated with this game. So one example of that is that you look at the set of events for a game, and 20% or so of them will just not be there, will not be returned by the API. I've not seen a pattern to that. Right. So as a first cut for a rating system for this game, and this is an extremely first cut, but just for a first version of the rating system, it's really just on a scale of 0 to 100%. The number of games you've won divided by the number of games you participated in, and the number you participated in is just increased by 1. The idea being that if you have a small number of total games, you don't get straight to 100% on your first win. It brings you to 50%. And if you get lots of wins in a row, you can approach 100% not regen. 3449. Let me just refresh to make sure this is still working. All right, so here's the web interface that shows the final rankings. This is based on a small number of games that I've been able to import so far, so it's very incomplete. But this shows a list of players sorted by their rankings, highest rankings at the top. So Ruiz gets a rating of 67, which probably means that this person won 2 games and participated in 2 games and won both of them. So it's 2 divided by 2 plus 1. And this is the rating that you would get if you played in 1 game and won the game. And the small number of total possible scores is low just because so few games have actually been imported so far. So Reagent allows us to create user interface components in a web page as functions. So this example of a simple component and how you would represent the HTML in a style very similar to Hiccup. And how you would embed components within components. And the function takes arguments, then you can then it changes what's shown in the component. So just to give an idea there. So here's a scoreboard. We're going to represent the set of ratings as an atom. And we have an updater that is going to talk to the server, find out what the ratings are, checking in every 15 seconds, and updating the set of ratings here. And then our user interface component here that is using the ratings, every time ratings changes, the user interface component will automatically update. So for that reason, if I were to import some more games now, these numbers would be refreshed within 15 seconds without needing to refresh the page. See, this is the API endpoint is ratings, and if we go back into the server side, we can see where ratings is defined. And this is the function that we looked at a second ago. The calculate ratings function takes a database as an argument. So here's that function. So it's really just collecting up a bunch of events and doing that calculation. You can see here examples of how Datomic works. So in this case, I needed to know the number. I needed to find all the join events to be able to calculate a rating. DS is the data source or database. Doing a Datomic query. And let's see. I'd like to show this side by side with the map of how the schema works. Right. So what I'm showing here, this is very similar to the diagram that I would have made if I were working with an SQL database. And this is exactly what I did for Datomic as well, using the ADI library on top of Datomic. And I think that's because ADI is actually designed to make Datomic feel more like a more typical database. One thing that Datomic allows you is to say, I have a certain attribute, and if you want to put that attribute on anything you want to put it on, with an SQL database, you have a table that has columns. In Datomic, you're coming up with a set of columns. and the column is not necessarily associated with any given table, is one way to think of it. So there's this convention that the name of your column is going to have a slash in the middle of it, where what you put before the slash is probably going to be what you would have thought of as a table name, and what comes after the slash is what you would typically think of as the column name, as a way to remind yourself that sort of these columns are related to each other. And the ADI interface that I'm using pretty much requires that you take that approach. A column is only associated with one table. So let me show that in the schema representation over here. All right, so let's take an example here. Thinking of this in SQL, game is a table and new ID is a column on that table. Let me make sure I can see the chat. All right. In Datomic, what this is actually creating is an attribute type game/new ID, and these are like triples. You could basically put this column onto any table you wanted to, and it just happens to be called game/new ID. The way that you define the schema in ADI, however, you're giving up that flexibility, which you probably don't even want in most cases, and it's, you give the name of the table, you give a name of a column, under the hood it does that, but it won't allow you to attach this to any other entity because you're doing it in this manner. So I had a very simple schema that I was trying to put together. I was very happy with that restriction. I'm not sure how often that would be an issue where you would want to create sort of a column that exists on multiple tables. I guess with SQL databases, we sometimes do something similar with attributable tables, where you've got something that's not quite a foreign reference, where you have separate columns to represent, this is the table I'm referring to, and here's a row number within the table. That's a fairly unusual thing to do within SQL databases. It seems like the kind of thing that Datomic was designed for, though, as though that was the typical case. Let's see, the querying. I mean, I really think the query language was just very straightforward and intuitive. I mean, what would this piece of SQL look like? Let's see, we're selecting account.name and game.id, and we're going to need to join a bunch of different tables together. So, I mean, I find this compared to that pretty similar. This and this pretty similar. And the fact that it's if I needed to generate that, which I know I've often needed to do with SQL, these are data types instead of strings. So that, to me, that looks like a win right there. That this is just, it's very natural to switch to that sort of query syntax. Something that is seems a little bit more difficult to do in Datomic is when you have a transaction, you're inserting new information. I've gotten error messages that basically say something along the lines of, in this transaction, you did two things that conflict with each other. And it shows you the two datums that were inserted that it thinks are contradictory. And those two datums have 15-digit ID fields in them that are relevant to figuring out what they mean. And so to me, that's kind of like a really vague hint as to what I did wrong. Yeah, I think that's been another issue. It's a new database. The error messages are not as easy to work with, but they're not particularly bad either. Actually, so I have an ongoing issue that is not resolved yet, which is I've mentioned that the API for this game is weird, and the way the API works and its quirks actually seem to change over time. Depending on whether you're looking at games from one year or another year, the API seems to work differently. So I have not been able to get the data fetching to work for every. If I just start importing random games, it's going to fail fairly quickly, which is why I have such a small number of games in place so far. So I can actually do that, and it'll go through a few games and fail, and you'll see an example of the kind of error situations that need to be dealt with. So I'm not sure why that's taking so long. I'll leave it running and. Well, it's actually having difficulty launching REPL. Anyway, the overall, I haven't had a lot of problems with Datomic, and sort of the things that I've needed to do with it on this particular project are not that advanced. So I don't think that Datomic overall has really been a big issue for this particular project. It's pretty much served the purpose that I would have used an SQL data source for. See, this is an example of what a record needs to look like when you insert it into Datomic using the ADI library. By the way, I have never seen that error before, so I'm not going to try to troubleshoot it now. I'll deal with that later. So this is the table name, and the rest of this is the various column and value, column value, column value. So this very long number is an arbitrarily assigned ID to represent that type. So no, it's not. My console's cutting off. The type is a keyword. So in this case, an account has to be the long ID representing an account. That makes sense. Because account is one of our tables, so that's basically an entity ID. Okay, so one thing that is a little bit one thing that I just thought of that was a little strange to me working with Datomic. Let me get an example of that right here. This is a totally redundant column, and I've been putting columns like this on all of my entities. The event type is already represented separately, the player is represented separately, the account is represented separately, but I'm putting them all together. sort of a compound key. Um, when I have some new information to put into Datomic, I don't necessarily know whether that particular bit of information already exists. So I might want to insert the information, or I might want to update the information that's already there. And so Datomic calls this an upsert. It's either an insert or an update, which makes perfect sense, except that you can only do it if you have one column on that table that you can use as a key, where if that particular column matches up, then you're wanting to update that existing record rather than inserting. So oftentimes, the key that I would want to use is a combination of several different columns, and so I have to create another column and maintain a separate column just to match that. So let's look at an event. All right, so I've already got a type, I've already got a player, I've already got an account. If certain things are the same, then it's the same event. I create a separate column just to represent that compound key. I require it to always be present, and it's unique. And it's unique in the sense that if you see it twice, it's because you're talking about the same thing. When I create events, I'm responsible for coming up with both this column and the other columns, even though this one should be derived based on the others. So that seems like an example of something that a higher level library should be taking care of, making sure that my key field matches the others. And I think this is the only way that you can really make upserting work in cases where you don't have a natural key on a single field. This project is definitely still a work in progress. There's some more work to do in terms of importing games, and that's really just a matter of fixing one issue at a time as I find them until it's able to import all the games. So that'll be straightforward. The user interface at this point is still very basic. You know, I'd like to be able to have people be able to link to their particular rating from their profile page. I'd like for someone to be able to look at one of these accounts and understand how that person got a 50, what games contributed to the score. The scoring system itself is very simplistic at this point, and that was the main thing I wanted to address, is to come up with a more sophisticated scoring system. So these are all sort of issues for later work. I could continue discussing like the ideas I have for how to improve the rating algorithm. I guess I'm not sure if people are interested in hearing more about ideas for future enhancements, or if there are more questions, or if we should discuss more about the current implementation. So for now, I'm going to push forward on the possibilities for enhancing the rating system. So if we look back at this schema that I came up with, a strange thing about this is that the rating system that I'm using so far only uses these top 4 tables. The scoreboard has been completely ignored. And the reason that scoreboard has been imported is because I feel like that is going to be necessary for the next steps in the rating system. So right now it's only looking at whether a player won or lost in any games that they were in. There's 2 big directions that the rating system really needs to go in to be a top-notch rating system. One of those is to start looking at the difficulty of a game. So if I get a win in a game that is filled with other strong players, that win should count for more, and vice versa. So that will be a fairly straightforward thing to add in. The other direction to go in is looking at part of a game. So this is actually a very long-running game. It's turn-based with other people, typically a turn every day or two. So we're talking about a game that can last for months, potentially as long as a year, and occasionally multiple years. So that introduces several unusual challenges for producing a rating system. One is this possibility that players are going to not stick around for the entire game. So you play the first half of a game, and you find a buddy to hand the game off to because you want to go off and do something else. They take over for you. How do you look at a game where multiple people have worked together to sort of get to the end of the game? How do you rate, how did this person do in the first half of the game? How did this other person do in the second half of the game? You can't determine that just by looking at whether that particular player won or lost at the end. Also, with a long-running game, even if one person is there for the entire game, there is the potential for their skill level as a player to actually change over the course of a game. So it would be good to look at cases like, you've got a game that starts out with a bunch of fairly weak new players, but they're new players, they're learning quickly, and by the time the game is halfway over, some of those players have started to become very strong players. And that's going to make the game that much more difficult for the other players, and that should be taken into account. And also, even though this person hasn't won the game yet, there are already signs that they're becoming a strong player, and their rating should go up halfway through the game. With very long-running games, you don't want to wait for the end of a game before starting to take that game into account. The total number of games you've got to work with for a scoring system is going to be small, so you have to take advantage of everything you've got. So the idea here is that by keeping track, sorry, I was just checking the chat log. By keeping track of how players are doing on a turn-by-turn basis, as the scoreboard shows, this is sort of the first step into looking at, okay, a player in their first 20 turns has managed to increase their planets from 1 to 50. That's a good sign. If you look at the number of planets that all the other players in that game have on that turn, you might be able to estimate that this player's odds of winning the game have gone up by 20%. Just looking at their number of planets and the number of planets of their opponents. And so, even though they haven't actually won yet, you can say their odds of winning increased during this time, so they have done well during this time and their rating should increase, and vice versa. And that also, by dividing a game up into chunks like that and sort of measuring skill on a month-by-month basis, you deal both with the issue of players being replaced and with the issue of getting more immediate results and having the ratings tune themselves more quickly. Another issue is there are 11 different possible races that you can play as in this game, and the races are definitely not all created equal. So some of those races are generally considered to be stronger races, where a player is more likely to win if they choose that race. That's sort of another thing that the credit for a victory should be somewhat reduced if you had chosen a stronger race, and you should get more credit if you manage to win as one of the weaker races. It also affects the significance of some of these items on the scoreboard. So some of the races have very small ships, but they're still valuable ships. Those ships aren't going to contribute as much to the military score as the ships of some of the other races. So that's something that will need to be taken into account to to interpret the scoreboard correctly. There's also the possibility of a follow-up talk if anyone wants to continue hearing about this at a later stage of the project. There's certainly a lot more work to be done. All right, so I think it's time to wrap up the presentation then. My name is Eric Levine. I'm with MCNA Dental Insurance, and we're planning on opening up an office in Ireland soon. So hopefully I'll get a chance to meet some of you later. Right, thanks everyone. Yeah, definitely. So this particular project I'm talking about is definitely a side hobby project, but we definitely use Clojure extensively at MCNA as well, and we definitely have a need for Clojure programmers. So if I can post on that in the comments later.